Well, anyways, we're back in lesson 9, and I want to go back to the page. Unfortunately, it's not numbered. That says the effect of the incarnation at the top. Because we were dealing with verse 9 of chapter 12 that was giving us some trouble. So let's read that verse 9 and see what it was, and then hopefully we can clarify it. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, chapter 12, verse 9. And then in our notes, it's the page in lesson 9 that says the effect of the incarnation at the very first point. Everybody good? Did somebody grab papers from Molly?
I did.
You've got them? All right. Friendship, yay. All right. Well, your intentions were good. Yeah, okay, so everybody, we're good where we're at here? So, we're in lesson 9, last week's lesson. Last week's lesson, at the top of the page, it says the effect of the incarnation. There we are. All right. Do you guys have what you need over here? I've got more for... What we're in right now is what we handed out last week, but we will eventually be getting into lesson 10, which is up here on the front pew if anybody needs one, lesson 10. Everybody good? All right. We're moving on. 12:9. So we're back. We're touching base back on that because there was some discussion about the when of this. And it's this concept of Satan being defeated. So the question was, well, this surely is referring to when he was thrown out of heaven. Initially. Well, I wasn't able to really verbalize my thoughts last week and this kind of stuff. That's not what this is referring to. Okay? That is not what this is referring to. Because of the context of what this is talking about. Now, I want to remind you that this is symbolic language. Okay? So we're not talking about understanding this as historical narrative. See, when we read this verse, it has a very historical narrative feel to it, as if this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But that's not the way we look at this. This is talking about the thing that we gather from this verse is the defeat of Satan. So, when was Satan defeated? When he was cast out? When? At Calvary. So what this is referencing is his defeat at Calvary. And verse 11 is our key to that. Verse 11 says, and they overcame him. Why? Because of the blood of the Lamb. This is when he was cast out of heaven initially, when he rebelled against God, then how does the blood of the Lamb cause that? It doesn't. So it does have the same flavor. It does have the same ring to it. But the casting down of Satan in our notes there, point 3 of referencing verse 9, is referring to at Calvary. If you look at Luke 10:17 and 18, when it talks about the 70 returning, and they said that we were casting out demons in your name, and then Jesus says, anybody know? Let's turn there. Luke 10:17 and 18. And the 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. So is he referencing when he rebelled and was cast out? Well, what is about to happen? What is happening? What began with his birth? Well, the whole process of the effect. See, if you look at our title of our little section here, it's the effect of the incarnation. You see, what was happening with the Jesus and the power of that was given to the 70 and affecting the demons was the beginning of the end for Satan. Okay? And so it's this process that's occurring that now this is the explanation of the things that I've been reading and kind of come to some conclusions, because this is tricky to understand. So let me read something else that might help us give a little understanding. You see, in our notes it says, notice how the defeat of Satan is tied in with the death of Christ. And we could look at John chapter 12. Someone look up John 12, 31 through 33. Be ready to read that here in a second. 255 here in my book. Okay. According to verse 7, it says, if we go back in Revelation 12, there was a war in heaven. That is, war in the supernatural realm. John pictures this war as a battle between God and Satan, who fight each other through their respective angels. Michael, the archangel responsible for Israel, serves as the commander of God's angelic army. Verses 8 and 9 show us that Satan loses the war, and John portrays his defeat by using an image common in Jewish apocalyptic writings. Satan and his demon allies are cast out of heaven to the earth. You see how that's symbolic of his defeat? Verse 11 makes clear that the supernatural war took place on the cross. The key phrase is by the blood of the Lamb. By his sacrificial death, Christ established a new covenant based on faith that carries the promise of eternal life in the consummated kingdom of God. So, I want to see if there's anything else that that we had here that would give us some understanding. So this concept here that we're seeing is speaking of an apocalyptic language of his ultimate defeat that occurred at Calvary. Is the point in time when it's talking about that defeat here is what it's referencing, but because of his blood. Now, so we talked about this last week, and I believe we need to pick up at point 2 then, having addressed where we left off there about where the dragon persecutes the woman who brought forth the child, and just touch base on some of this. So as a reminder, who did we say the woman represented? The church, or actually all of God's people, Old Testament and New Testament, right? But primarily the church in this context. Though Satan cannot do any damage to the man-child, he can persecute the woman, the church. And then we talk about the attacks of Satan upon the woman. Why didn't the serpent go into the wilderness after the woman? That's an interesting thing. If we look back here at these verses, so let's highlight these verses that we read last week. Actually, if I need to clarify that. I believe we left off and did not read these verses. Yeah, so let's read those verses 13 through 16. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So remember how we reconciled that concept of the woman bringing forth the child? Remember, because we said if it is just the church, then it's not possible that the church gave birth to Jesus, is it? But if it is representative of God's people, Old Covenant and New Covenant in this case, Were the Old Covenant people responsible for bringing about the Messiah? Yes. So we can understand it in that sense. So the woman who gave birth to the male child, verse 14, and the two things of the great eagle, or two wings of the great eagle, were given to the woman in order that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So this is some, this is some wild imagery, isn't it? So when we talk about this idea of why, the question there, point C, number 1, why didn't the serpent go into the wilderness after the woman? Why do you think? What? Any thoughts?
Well, God's in control.
Okay, he's in control. So we talked about the wilderness just kind of being the world itself, and that the church was in the world. But why couldn't he go after him? Because, it's clear that, okay, that you're on the right track. And then Bourne really points this out well. Why didn't the serpent go into the wilderness to get the woman? He couldn't. The wilderness here is the will of God. Where the Christian resides and is nourished of God, so long as the Christian abides in God's will, the serpent is powerless against him. Isn't that an interesting thought? If that is indeed true, is if someone is abiding in the will of God, that Satan has difficulty in that case, which is true. Are there any scriptures that bear this out? We just studied the book of James. Is there anything in there about that? This idea of that if you abide within the will of God, that Satan, in this case, it was talking about the attacks. It says this idea of why didn't the serpent go into the wilderness after the woman? And it was saying here, Bourne's point of view is that he couldn't, because the wilderness in this case is representative of the will of God, and if you rest in the will of God, then Satan is powerless. Okay. Yes, yeah, then nothing can separate us. What's the concept of submit to God? What are you essentially doing? Placing yourself in what? His will. And then it says resist the devil and what? He will flee. It's that order of things. It's that with hearing God's will. I think that's kind of bearing this out here a little bit. So the serpent makes an effort to remove the woman by casting out of his mouth a river of lies. See, if you recall that we're saying that the different imagery here that is used of Satan, I believe there's a list on the previous page. Dragon speaks of his great power. Serpent speaks of his deception. Devil means false accuser or slander. So here we're seeing the serpent acting, so it's with deception and lies. So the serpent makes an effort to remove the woman by casting out of his mouth a river of lies. This was how he drove the man and the woman from the garden. Satan floods the scene with false propaganda, heresy, false doctrine, in order to remove the woman from the wilderness of God's will. The symbolism of verse 16 is that every lie will ultimately be revealed to be just that. So, where it says, "And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river while the dragon poured out of his mouth." The symbolism is that it will ultimately be revealed, that those lies will be revealed. So, if we look at verse 17, where it talks about the dragon persecuting the rest of the woman's offspring. So in this case, when we talk about the woman representing Old Covenant people that brought forth the Messiah and the New Covenant people that are obedient, as it says here, to the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus, who is that speaking of specifically? Christian people, right? The rest of her offspring here symbolizes individual Christians. Though Satan cannot destroy the church, he can be very successful against individual Christians. Do you agree with that? That is very true. It's a one-by-one kind of a thing, and if you can break down the individuals, then the church as a whole can be affected, but it ultimately won't be overcome. Why did we say that the church itself will not be overcome? That it's ultimately victorious? It's a promise of God, absolutely. Is that there's some... It's because when Christ returns, he's coming for what? Which will mean that it is present. So in some form or fashion, when Christ returns, the church will be here. We cannot allow ourselves to be seduced by the lies of Satan and fall from grace. Hebrews 6, 4-6, and Hebrews 10:26, book of Hebrews essentially is about people that are turning their back on God, falling from grace. And what led them to do that? What led them to... Yeah, but what is that? It's deception and lies, right? Is that was sufficient. So that was wrapping up chapter 12, and now moving into chapter 13, which is lesson 10. So in this chapter, we will discover two principal ways in which Satan wages war against the church. Now, before we begin, we need to talk about something. So when we talk about biblical, this is going to sound really nerdy. In video games, at the end of the game, there's usually a really bad guy they call a boss. You're the boss level. So in the Bible, there's some names of entities that would be considered boss level bad guys that we talk about. So when we talk about this kind of end time stuff, when you watch the TV preachers and stuff, and they're talking about the end times, they always talk about what? Yeah. Right? Now, not as popular as the Antichrist is another one that pops up in Thessalonians. Yeah. And just about every time that you'll talk about the Antichrist and the man of lawlessness, they throw in there what? The beast of Revelation, right? Actually, two. One out of the sea and one out of the land, right? So, what happens in DP? You guys remember that? Gonna make me say it? Dispensational premillennial view. They lump all these three together into one entity. Put them all together. You want proof? Here's your proof. Many of you have this Bible. The Keyword Hebrew Greek Study Bible. Yeah? Quite a few of you have this one, right? Well, looky here. Chapter 13, 1-18, key has a little key, where there's the key. The sixth personality is the Antichrist. In Revelation 13, we have two beasts mentioned. The first, the Antichrist, is out of the sea, and the second beast is out of the earth. So, they identify from this perspective that the Antichrist is some sort of a world religious or a world political leader. And so they've lumped these together. primarily, just to clarify here, this one. This one they identify as something else. And that's a world religious leader, but we'll talk about that in the next week because we're not going to get to that tonight. So if we were dealing with this, because this is the common understanding. I mean, if you've heard this once, you've heard it a million times, the Antichrist, the Antichrist. Who's the Antichrist, right? Well, we've talked about this when we've studied John's epistles and also Thessalonians when we talk about the man of lawlessness. So we're going to spend some time tonight identifying specifically the beast out of the sea. And then we're going to figure out, we can talk about these at different points as we go here. So let's read it. Let's read through verse 8. And see what it says. Actually, let's read through, we'll read through verse 10. And he stood on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power, and his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him? And there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. That's interesting. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And it was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with a sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. So, let's take some time identifying some characteristics then of this beast that does come out of the sea. So we're talking about, in this chapter, we'll discover 2 principal ways in which Satan wages war against the church. So he wages war through world power. So a description of the beast. So this idea of 10 horns is representative of great or complete power. Great or complete power. What about 7 heads? That's interesting, isn't it? Wisdom? Yeah, there's great wisdom that we're talking about here that's involved. So if there's great wisdom, now, or complete or great wisdom. So now, we've studied again in the book of James, in other places as well, this idea of earthly wisdom versus heavenly wisdom. And when they talk about great wisdom, would this be heavenly wisdom? I mean, you can have a large amount of earthly wisdom, can't you? About how to operate in this world as a bad guy. You know, like, for example, you watch like a gangster movie, right? And they got a whole network that they've set up, and they know how to operate, and they're really cunning and wise as to how they can manipulate this, that, or the other and make money and all that kind of stuff. So the world would quantify that kind of things in a certain way as someone is maybe wise in the world. So we're talking about that kind of wisdom here, ways that is earthly wisdom. Now, this 10 diadems, what's another word for diadem? Because that's not one we use. Crown. This would be representative of what? Authority, power, this idea of, in the 10, we've got, again, a completeness. Now, here's an interesting thing. So, in verse 1, it says, and on his heads were blasphemous names. So these are the names of individuals, right? So we got to figure out who these 10 individuals are and what their names are. If this is world powers, then this is identifying 10 people, right? Is that how we're approaching this? Are we trying to link this up with individuals, specific individuals that we've obviously got 10 individuals? No, that's not how we're looking at this, right? So what about these names would be blasphemous? That were written upon. Now, what does this beast represent? No, what does it represent? World powers. Think of political world powers throughout since this was written in 95, 96 AD. What would be considered blasphemous name that a world power would assume? That would. No, that's religious. We'll get there in a minute. Talking about, well, there is overlap in many times of political and religious. Well, what about Caesar? What about it? Well, what? See this idea of Caesar worship, right? That's a title or a name that what? Assumes what? God's place. Rainey? Is to do what? Usurp God's authority. You don't need God, you got me. That's religious. Focus on political. Political. Now, again, there is overlap, but I think we would classify that as I would classify that as of what we're going to see about with this one. Kings? Okay. Well, are all kings then blasphemous? Okay, the ones who do what? Put themselves on level with who? Yes, so blasphemy is essentially what? Taking God down to our level or elevating ourselves to his level, correct? In a general sense. Now, are we aware of any political entities that have elevated themselves to godlike status throughout history? All the time. It's been all over the place. In fact, Domitian, this idea of emperor worship, they were told to do what? To bow down and worship the emperor. Or what? Or die. Which we're going to see how that plays out here in a little bit. So these blasphemous names would not be individuals. They would be titles that belong to God that men have assumed. Would someone please look up, well, let's all look there. Daniel chapter 7, verses 2 through 7. Good old Daniel. Now, remember, a lot of the language from Ezekiel and Daniel show up where? Shows up in the language and ideas and imagery are ideas that are brought forward to this in apocalyptic language. So chapter 7, verse 2, Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Right? Beasts of the sea, parallel. And four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind also was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Let's go ahead and read verse 8. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up from among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a great man, and the mouth uttering great boasts. Phew! Stay in Daniel. Now, there's a lot of parallels to these 2 beasts. Now, the source of the power of this beast, back in Revelation, just if you can remember, where did this beast gain its power that came out of the sea? Well, I'll save you from turning back. It was Satan that gave the beast power and authority. Okay, so now let's ask ourselves this question. The source of his power, this beast, that represents world power, was given to it by Satan. So this poses a difficult question for us. So if we're not careful here, we could assume that government itself is evil, that Satan is behind all governments. Is that true? Yeah, how do we know that? We know from the book of Romans, and that God himself established this idea of government and those that would be in authority. So it is possible to rule in such a way that is not guided by Satan, but do we see throughout history individuals who were likely empowered and guided by Satan in what they were doing politically through world power and conquest and all that stuff? Oh my. See, I like to think, and here's what's interesting. I like to think that U.S. government at one point in time was, for lack of a better word, pure. But how friendly is our government today becoming towards people of our persuasion? What's that? What do you mean at the beginning? Of what? Well, you're saying then it had...
Antichrist had to be there as well.
Okay, we need to talk about this because the way that we're using that word, I'm not sure we're talking about correctly. Non-Christians are not all antichrists.
Well,
you can't.
Right. There had to be people that was against Christ, though.
Yes. So we need to clarify this. It's in the book of John. It's simply talking about those that deny flesh and blood Jesus.
Okay.
That's that spirit of the Antichrist.
Okay.
Just people that are against Christianity are not Antichrist. So that we need to make sure we clarify that.
But there had to be people against Christ.
Sure, but we're talking about the government as a whole. I think that there were... Because if you're making that statement, then you're saying that all governments are guided by the beast, and if that's the case, then we're saying that...
No.
Well, that we're talking about individuals now.
Yes.
Okay, so it's getting a little tricky when we start discussing it in that way. We're thinking of a bigger picture sort of a thing than individual people. I don't want to lock this into individual people. Because even though it was Hitler, there was much more than Hitler. Even though there was Mao, there was much more than Mao. These are entire systems that have been developed that take on a figurehead and a name, but there's more than just that one individual that's involved. So when we look at here back in Daniel at verses 17 to 20, so we got an understanding of what's happening there with the four, and then over in verse 17, it says, these great beasts, which are four in number, are four kings who will arise from the earth. So this is more specific. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. In verse 20, and the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before the 3 of them which fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boast, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. So there's, again, most scholars believe that this fourth beast then is Rome, the Roman Empire. Earlier in Daniel 7, he speaks of the characteristics of the lion, bear, and leopard as descriptive of the world powers. So the reason that this is important to what we're talking about moving forward here in Revelation, there is no doubt in Daniel, what Daniel's describing here are world powers, individual kings and kingdoms. Right? When we talk about the statue that had the different characteristics of bronze and iron and all those kind of things, those are easily identified and have parallels. We know that there were great kingdoms that came up. What was the first world power that really showed up in the biblical history? The first world power that was really troublesome? Assyrians, right? I mean, there were others prior to that, but when we talk about historical powers, and from Assyria, we saw Babylon come to power. And in our men's Bible study, the last time I was able to attend, we talked about the greatness of Babylon and how extensive that was. And then from Babylon, who conquered Babylon? The Medes and the Persians. And then who conquered the Persians? Greeks. And then from there, the Romans. So we have a very specific progression of things that fall into place here. And so the fourth beast in this description is probably the Roman Empire. Notice the word probably. But the characteristics here, what's important, the characteristics of the lion, bear, and leopard are descriptive of world powers. The whole scene that we talk about that's in Revelation, back in chapter 13, is to help the reader understand that the enemy of the church is threatening and horrible. So, back in Revelation, in verse 3, it says, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. So, this healing of the death stroke is some of the words that's used here. So, when Christ was victorious over death, he gave the death stroke to world power. Right? However, even though that, all right, let's think about this. If world power, represented by the beast, gains its authority and power from Satan, and when Christ defeated Satan, then by the transitive property, if Satan is defeated, then who also is defeated? The world powers that are empowered by the beast, right? Now, does this mean that they're completely cut off? That they're like at that point in time when Christ, it's kind of this idea of the beginning of the end. When he was victorious over death, he gave the death stroke to the world power. However, even though that happened, world power continues to exist in spite of its fatal wound. You see how that's making sense? What happened in Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans and the Jews was, in that context of history, when Christ died and rose again, was this death stroke to world power. But even though it had taken its final wound, or its fatal wound, the world power still continues to exist in spite of this. So we have this idea. Now, I read some stuff, historical stuff, that said that actually what this was talking about was Nero. Anybody here know how Nero died? I didn't know this. He committed suicide, slit his throat. But after he did this, rumors started circulating that he really didn't do it, or actually that he came back to life, or that he would come back to life. And so eventually it circulated enough in and around Rome at that time that he had actually suffered a fatal blow, but had somehow risen, but we know that he didn't. And so this commentator was kind of maybe linking this to Nero. Feels like a bit of a stretch, but here's the thing that does make sense. How did Nero treat Christians? So he did persecute Christianity. So he was this. The beast. World power, his organization, his reign as Caesar, he was representative of power that was given by Satan to persecute Christianity, and so he falls into this category. This is a category. So then from there we have Domitian that shows up later, right? He still falls into this. And then others that have fallen in and persecuted Christianity since would still fall under that. So it's in essence what we have is Nero all over again. We have Nero showing what's happening in different places in the world right now. China's tightening down on Christianity right now. As far as in North Korea, some of the stuff that you hear out of that, whew. Who was it that we heard talk that was a Christian? Was that around? Was that the guy that they... Was that a guy that Trump brought?
Oh, yeah.
And he was talking about how he was persecuted for his Christianity and all that kind of stuff, and the stuff that, whew. That's world power, empowered by Satan to persecute the church. And it's going to happen for how long? 42 months. Isn't that what it said? It said 42 months, right? What's 42 months? The entire church age. It's a time, a times, and a half time, right? Remember that? Or 1,260 days. Those are all synonymous terms representing the same thing. So, now here's something else. People are amazed and follow after the beast because world power is very persuasive and threatening. It is convincing and at times very attractive. That's not true, is it? Now, see, we think we're immune to that here in the United States, right? We don't follow our leaders like they do in North Korea, or they do in China, or they do in Russia. Careful with that. I in some form or fashion, I think it's what we have now and what we had before now and what we had before then and all this kind of stuff. See, here's the thing. One of the most powerful lessons that we ever had when I was going through the Truth Project was this idea of how we understand the civil government and authorities and how we relate to it as Christians. You see, the way God designed it was for a very specific purpose. Government has a very specific purpose. It's to promote good and punish evil. That's it. There's not much more that they're supposed to do. But what happens is government assumes God's responsibilities and, frankly, the church's responsibilities and inserts themselves in where God should be. Let me give you an example. You can't provide for yourself. You're in need for food. Where do you go? Who's your savior? Government. You have a broken home and your child needs a father. Where do you go? You go to government. You don't believe me? Just go on a government website and you'll see where they're trying to fill those gaps. And what happens is these spheres that God has designed for the family, that He's designed for the church, that He's designed for government itself, government has grown over top all of it. And we look to the government as our Savior. Now, what you're talking about, it did manifest a little bit more in some unusual ways, is that when certain individuals became president, that now this is my Savior. And it's happened in our, I would say that I witnessed quite a bit of it happening with Obama, where people were looking to him as a Christ figure. But I would venture to say that there's probably some out there that look to Trump the same way. And they do. The government is your Savior. Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, there are certain things that the church is supposed to do that government has usurped. And then people, so there's that. I'm not doing a very good job of verbalizing exactly how that plays out. But I mean, if you get a chance to study the Truth Project and the lesson on government and how we relate to it, it's incredibly powerful. And what we see happening is that the beast, the world powers, they assume God's position and title, and they call for glory and honor and reverence and worship. And we don't think of it like that, but that's what they do. And then that's the way that our world is right now and has been. So further response of the people, to worship the beast is to worship Satan. Right? Because if you look backwards, if the beast then is world power and you worship world power or political powers, and if that political power is gaining its authority and power from Satan, then again, by the transitive property, who are you worshiping? You're worshiping Satan. That's what it's saying. The threat, when we talk about this, of the beast is limited neither to Rome nor the first century, for the beast is allowed to exercise his authority for 42 months, as explained above. This symbolic number refers to the entire period of time from the giving of the revelation in AD 95-96 to the second coming of Christ. Throughout these centuries, Satan continues to look for opportunities to turn rulers and governments into instruments of his evil will. Domitian and Rome were early examples of this demonic strategy. In more recent times, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and so many others have been Nero all over again for the church. The teachings of Jesus and Peter and Paul show that human governments are not inherently evil, that they are gifts from the Lord meant for our good. However, John's vision of the beast from the sea serves as a warning to God's people. Rulers and governments tend to try to put themselves in the place of God, demanding absolute loyalty. Satan will seek to use political powers to destroy Christians who bow instead to the lordship of Christ. This is one of the realities that make the labor pain so painful. John calls on believers to open their eyes to Satan's methods and be on their guard against his assaults. So, we have this descriptive of Caesar worship in John's day. The power of the beast is so convincing that people ask, who can war against the beast? Right? Who can stand against us? Careful. So, rats. We can get very far. So the power and activity of the beast, we talk about his period of activity is for 42 months, the Christian era, the blasphemy spoken against God and his people. Government never does that. And in verse 7 it talks about the apparent destruction of the church, but it's not. There are times when world powers have brought much damage to the church and oppression, but it will not destroy it. Do not be surprised by a great number who worship the beast. One last thing I want to read is this. And we'll pick up at point 2. He wages war through false religions. This is short, but it's good. World power is always adored where worldliness prevails. And it is always able to command the homage of the worldly spirit to which in so many ways it makes its appeal. World power is very persuasive and threatening. It is convincing and at times very attractive. And that's similar language to what we just saw there. World power is always adored where worldliness prevails. Then there was the comment at the end of the chapter. All whose names were not written in the Lamb's Book of Life will worship the beast. Glenn Bourne says, it may prove to be a startling revelation to someday see the difference between God's record and the local church membership records on earth. This is true, unfortunately. There's only one book that matters when it comes down to that. And then the last thing here is an appeal to give heed. The meaning of verse 10 is that the Christian can expect persecution. In this, the Christian must show perseverance. Now, I want to say this. We don't have time to get into this, obviously. But these verses would be very favorable to the Calvinist. Verse 8, and all who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world. Wait a minute. You mean my name was written down before the world was? Well, that rings of what? And it rings of determinism, right? So we don't have time to get into that, but we have ways very clear ways that we can deal with that. See, and also it says there in verse 10, you guys ever heard of the perseverance of the saints? That's one of the 5 points of TULIP. That's the P. So this would be favorable to the Calvinists, but we have an explanation, but we don't have time to get into it tonight. So we might open with that next week. Or you can do some study on your own, which would be great, and then we can talk about it.